So the interesting thing about large language models is like the bias comes out from the model itself, but also from how you create instructions yourself. Like, what is the policy that you're giving?
I'm Cassie Cocaro, Head of Communications at Thorn.
And I'm Paylez Halai, Senior Manager of Partnerships at Thorn, and this is Safe Space. One of the things that we at Thorn have been thinking about a lot, and as we build these tools, is bias. And it's something that you recently wrote a comprehensive piece about, which is just bias in content moderation. So I just wanted to ask you a few questions about that, really. I'm sure it's on your mind as much as it is ours. So give us the 60-second version. What does bias in a moderation system look like, and why does it matter?
It's going to be hard to get me to say anything in 60 seconds,
We'll
especially
start
something
with
as
60.
complicated as this, but I will give it a try. Basically, like, humans are biased. They come with their own cultural assumptions. They come with their own separate experiences. They come maybe even with different assumptions about what training might mean. And so any human in a moderation system is going to have some amount of bias, and it can show up as bias against a certain group of people, which is what people often assume. But, another bias is like, what languages do your moderators speak? And you have a biased system if your moderators only speak one language. It's biased against the other languages because you don't have as many resources. So there's many different ways that it can show up. And then machine learning models are trained on human labels. So if your people are biased, then they might create biased labels, and then your machine learning system might learn off of that. Similarly, large language models are trained off of human input, much more broad, but then that also introduces a much broader range of potential bias that could be brought in. So there's no system in moderation or trust and safety that does not have any kind of bias. Every single system will. And I think my point in writing this piece and sort of speaking about it in general is, if we know that every moderation system is biased, then it's our responsibility to try to do something about it to mitigate that bias. And it's not like, oh, I found one tiny little piece and I fixed it. It's like an ongoing process, because fundamentally, inherently, people are biased, and we're dealing with people solving problems with other people. And so it's always going to be an issue.
Yeah. So I feel like so much of it is just about coming out and owning it, right? Accepting that this is just a norm of what we're building. What kind of ways do you see it actually manifests, like in real world examples in content moderation, and areas where it does get really, really tricky? I want to kind of just shine a light on how hard it is to moderate without bias and build systems without bias.
Yeah, I can give you a couple examples that I've seen personally, and there's many, many more that exist. So this is not at all comprehensive, but just an illustration. So, I'm aware of bias myself. I try to build systems that are as unbiased as possible. And I also make mistakes. So I was writing a policy for Grindr. I was redoing the content moderation policy there. And I was reviewing a policy that we had on gore and violence. And we had gotten a lot of user complaints about people who had profile photos for hunting. Like, it was somebody who had like gone deer hunting, and it was like picture of them with a dead deer. And so there were complaints about it. And I've been vegetarian since I was a child. I was raised as a Buddhist. And so I was like, yeah, like, get those hunting pictures out of there. Like, this is a dating app. We don't need blood. We don't need dead animals. Like, that is not the vibe that we are going for. So I wrote in the policy, like, no dead animals or something like that. then when I was getting ready to finalize the policies, I did a peer review. So I had some friends of mine who are at other platforms read the policies and give me feedback, because I was a one-person policy team. So I had nobody internally who I could share it with. And very kindly, people took a look, and somebody was like, Alice, you know that there are like entire cultures in the United States, but also around the world, where hunting is like a thing that people do together to bond. It's culturally appropriate. It's seen as like a positive thing, and it's seen as a like marker of their culture, and that's why they put it on a dating profile, because they want to meet somebody who maybe does it too, or agrees. And I was like, yes, obviously, now that you put it that way, I understand. But to me, I had this like very visceral, like, oh, dead animal reaction, and I didn't think about that not everybody has that reaction.
Yeah.
Obviously, because they're trying to upload those pictures on a dating app.
Yeah.
So that was just like my own bias coming through. And that can be, everybody who does trust and safety is going to have something like that is their spot. Another example is I was working with a team to do machine learning, fixed machine learning model on hate speech. And I was looking at some of the model's responses, and I saw that it had flagged some super innocuous statements. And they were about people's religion and the country of origin. And specifically, it was sort of things like talking about like being a proud Muslim or being from Pakistan, or, and it was like flagging these as hateful. And I was like, what the heck? This is crazy. And I took a look at it, and it was like, because so many comments that were anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant had been flagged as hate speech, the machine learning model had extrapolated from that the key word that signified that those statements were bad was the identity of the person who the hate speech was against, not the actual hateful part. Because it's a machine learning model, it just picks up on patterns. And so then obviously we had to be like, that is not the pattern you were looking for.
Wow.
You were looking for the opposite of that pattern. And we fixed it, and it was totally fine. But it just sort of shows, like, if you're not careful and you're not looking for those biases, like, your systems can sometimes do the opposite of what you're intending for them to do. And that's an easy mistake to make.
Yeah, it seems like in so many situations, it's just not intuitive. And this may seem like a silly question, but do you find yourself still learning like that? Just even though it's, you've been working on this for so long, I would imagine new things pop up that kind of occur to you in the situation.
Yeah, all the time. And, especially the last year or so, I've been working with LLMs really heavily. And that was something that I played around with a little bit over the last few years. But, have really been all day, every day, the last year or so. And so, yeah, it's so interesting to see what assumptions are made with LLMs interpreting policy, and how you can steer them and sort of tell them what your definition of hateful is, or what your definition of hate speech is. Has to be like much more precise than you would with a person, for example. But then the results that you get are also much more precise. And so the interesting thing about large language models is like the bias comes out from the model itself, but also from how you create instructions yourself. Like, what is the policy that you're giving? What are you leaving out of that policy that then the LLM has to fill the gaps in for? Like, that's where the bias creeps in. And that's definitely something that you didn't have to think about in the same way with ML models.
Yeah, I really love the first example you gave, because it's almost so mundane, right? Like, you didn't sit there spending time ruminating whether this was morally acceptable or not. You just had a visceral reaction because of the way that you were raised and your experiences. But as soon as somebody explained to you that, well, that's not the case, and this is culturally important, etc., you immediately are able to correct the error, right? And you're not necessarily tied to that decision. And I think that's a really good example for us to think about when we think about content moderation. That it's often mundane and it's often so easily corrected as well.
Yeah, there's endless improvements that can always be made to any system, and it's important to have those systems in place to be able to catch your own bias or the bias of the system that you've set up. I think that's um, the scariest thing is when people think that they've set something up that is completely reasonable
Mhm.
because it's reasonable to them, and they
Yeah.
don't have some kind of external check or balance on what they're doing. And so for me, like, I was a one-person policy team. Having that external commentary was so incredibly helpful. And that's like the takeaway for sure, is just don't ever rely on one person's judgment, because there will always be some edge case they didn't think of.
Right. And the hunting profile picture, let's take that one. That, to me, relatively low stakes. But again, that could be my bias showing. But I want to switch over to something a little bit more high stakes, and how bias shows up, systemic bias, moderate bias shows up on more high risk surfaces. So at Thorn, of course, our focus is on child safety. When it comes specifically to child safety or other high harm areas, what are things in this area that you worry about most? And are there contexts where these failures feel particularly consequential?
I mean, all of it is consequential, honestly. Like, I don't think there's anything in child safety that doesn't have really serious consequences. That's why it's the hardest and
Hmm.
most important work that we do as trust and safety professionals. Certainly the hardest work that I've ever done. With bias, I think there's a few things. There's obviously the really careful balance between getting automation and human review right.
Hmm.
And both have their own kinds of biases or gaps that the other can possibly fill, but making sure there's a lot of checks and balances there. I think one example that I can think of with bias and child safety work is, obviously there are so many different cultural definitions of what does child mean, what does sexual mean, what is the age of consent, what is the cultural expectation of when a child is old enough to marry. Like, there is, that line that we think of in, the United States, for example, seems very clear cut, but in other cultures, it's different. And so when you're thinking about child safety and you're thinking about child safety norms, like, there's all sorts of things there. And then language is another really big one.
Hmm.
I think when people think of child safety, they often think of images, and of course, that's some of the hardest content to review and to see just on an emotional level. But grooming is another really big issue in
Hmm.
child safety, and that's in text often or in spoken language. Making sure that if you're reviewing for grooming, that it's not just in one language, like,
Yeah.
is and how, and not only the language, but like, how do people speak about it? Like, what are the ways that people groom? It will be different depending on every culture, and it will be different depending on every language. And
Hmm.
not having that full coverage, I think, is like another example of bias. So that's where I worry. I think LLMs are really helpful in coming a long way and allowing teams to have more language coverage than ever before. But uh, I think that space still, there's a that can be done.
Yeah, bias. I feel like even just in this conversation, I'm kind of rethinking the way that I think about bias, because bias can feel like such a loaded word, like it's almost intentional. But the way that you're talking about it, it's so influenced just by norms, by cultural norms, and and what is normal, right? Depending on where you're from and what language you speak and how you think. So I feel like bias needs so much unpacking. So that, thanks for unpacking that here as well.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I think, yeah, people bias feels like a triggering term these days. It's like, like I'm not biased. Nobody on my team is biased. Like we're fair. We care about all humans. Like that is, what people want to say. But having gaps in your moderation system means that there will be some groups of people that are disproportionately affected by your moderation in different ways. And often that's marginalized people in one way or another. And that could be marginalized by their gender, their age, their language, their culture, their orientation. There's so many different variables that somebody can have a different experience than somebody else on a platform, and how your moderation system can treat those. And often, I think at this point, trust and safety has been around for so long, we have all the bases covered, like the major things. And so bias is often small little gaps that just like haven't been filled in yet. And so that doesn't feel like huge institutional on purpose bias. Like it doesn't feel like biased against a certain person on purpose. But to that person who has been affected by moderation systems that don't work as well for them as they do for other people, or they don't have the same accuracy rate for them as they might for other people, that still feels like a system that is not working for you. And that is bias.
Yeah, and that perspective is so much more forgiving to us as humans, but I think it makes moderating so much more complex because it is so nuanced.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's interesting.
With that in mind, then, what does a better system look like, right? You already said the goal isn't a bias-free system, and there's a lot of talk about a kind of a moderator system that includes, a human and a machine. What does that look like to you? Like, what does a good human in the loop design actually look like in practice?
Again, I think there's as many different human in the loop systems as there are systems themselves. It really should be super custom. I think that's the thing that I learned the most in my career is every single platform has such different needs, such different users, different kinds of content, different contexts, different trade-offs that they need to make, and different decisions they need to make about what is safe or relatively low stakes to automate, what really needs careful review. I think one thing that I hear a lot from people that I want to push back on a little bit is people often say, well, AI is not as good at moderating as people are. And so human in the loop means like a person needs to check the automated system. I find in my work a lot, I make just as many mistakes. And I've been doing this stuff for a really long time. And I think really carefully and thoughtfully. And I still make mistakes. And often my mistakes can be caught by automated systems. And so I think the key for me is not necessarily AI does task A and a human does task B. It's having a system of checks and balances against both, and somebody or multiple somebodies, a system that is very critical of both and is asking all of those questions and is like, what's working here? What's not working here? What are the gaps? Let's break down all of the metrics and see like where are the areas that are the least consistent or affecting people more than others. Human in the loop, I don't know is the right term. I feel like it needs to be, I don't know, just like a really strong human questioning of everything.
Yeah, like more, and collaboration between humans and systems like that. Okay, so this is super complex, high stakes work, not just what we were talking about with bias, but trust and safety and content moderation in general. There are huge risks if we get it wrong. If you found that interesting, there's more to this conversation. You can catch additional highlights and the full Safe Space episode here.